Hello there, I'm Aiden and welcome to A Pastor's Life for Me. Today, we are breaking down the book of Leviticus. I know it's been a while since our last one, but this book took a lot more work than the other two, hence the length of this video. Leviticus is a book that is often disregarded and not talked about much by Christians, and it's also often misunderstood. Either people taking things out of context, or not understanding the purpose behind some of the laws in the books, or just misunderstanding the book itself. For these reasons, I don't want to skim over the book, but take some actual time to dive into it. So, let's jump on in. Leviticus is the third book in the Bible. It's also the third book of the Torah or Pentateuch, and also the third book of the books of Moses. It was written by Moses just like the other books in the Torah, although of course there are some who would disagree with that. Since it was written by Moses, it was written somewhere around 1445 BC or later. Since Exodus closes at 1445 and Numbers begins only a month later, all of Leviticus takes place within that time period. So Moses would have written it after that. The exact date, though, is unknown. The other option people go with is similar to Exodus. Leviticus was an oral tradition until the 7th to 6th century BC, after the Babylonian exile, when a priest would have compiled it. I, of course, have issues with this, since again, they are saying that Moses did not write it. My other issue has to do with 2 Kings 22. In this chapter, Hilkiah finds the book of the law and brings it to King Josiah, who then reads it and reads it before all of Israel. How could he read the book of the law if it didn't exist until some 150 years later after the Babylonian exile? And some will say that the book that Josiah read was just Deuteronomy, which could be true. The same issue arises with Deuteronomy because they will date that as the same time that they date Exodus and Leviticus. All that to say, the book was written by Moses sometime after 1445 BC. Now, the date range of the book is difficult to state. Bible Blueprints and Bible at a Glance will date it from 1445 all the way until 70 AD. Basically, they state from when the book happened all the way until 70 AD, when Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed and the sacrificial system ended. Now, I have a few issues with that. They say the law is applied until shortly after the death of Christ, when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Now, it is true that the law is applied until shortly after Christ's death, about 3 days. They were still done by Jewish Christians until Acts 10 or even Acts 15. But both of those chapters take place long before 70 AD. To state why I disagree with their date range is because the laws ended upon the institution of the New Covenant, which took place at Christ's death and resurrection. To say that the laws ended in 70 AD because the temple was destroyed is wrong on multiple levels. Even if you were to argue that 70 AD ended the practice of the laws by the Jews, you'd still be wrong. Now, the sacrifices in Leviticus did end in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple, but that doesn't even cover half the book. Jews to this day still practice the clean and unclean laws. So to say that the laws ended in 70 AD doesn't make any sense, especially when devout Jews still practice many of these laws to this day. Now, when I date range a book, I refer to the historical time period it covers, as in the time period when the laws were first given. We know when this is because Exodus and Numbers give us a framework. Exodus ends on the first day of the first month of the second year, and the second year referring to the second year after they exited Egypt. Numbers begins on the first day of the second month of the second year. So this is 1445 BC because the Red Sea took place at 1446 BC. This means that the date range of Leviticus is 1 month, that being the first month of the second year. Leviticus likely didn't happen at the same time as Exodus for a couple of reasons. Number one, 2 of Aaron's sons are killed by God in Leviticus 10. Number 2, the tabernacle wasn't erected until Exodus chapter 40, meaning that Aaron's sons couldn't have died until after Exodus 40. literature and style of the book, it is mostly law with some historical narrative as well. In essence, the book is God says, do these things. What those things are, described in detail. Then we have some narrative of these things being done. That leads us into sections. Like Exodus, this book does not have clear section breaks, so it's most commonly broken up due to the subject of the chapters. This can range from being quite simple, like Bible blueprints, or quite complex and long, like Zondervan's Pictorial Encyclopedia, or somewhat in between, like Encountering the Old Testament. For time's sake, we will look at Bible blueprints, but if you'd like to look at the others, pause the video 13 to 16 seconds ago. Bible blueprints put section 1 as chapters 1 through 9, the types of offerings to the Lord, which is alright, but I would break it after chapter 7. Then have chapters 8 through 10 about the consecration and death of Aaron's sons. Chapters 1 through 7 speak of the 5 types of offerings, though technically it's 6. The 5 often referred to are the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering, and the 6th being the ordination offering, which is commonly skipped, but is listed with the other 5 at the end of the laws about the offerings in 737. After this, we see the consecration of Aaron's sons, the Lord's acceptance of Aaron's gift, and the death of his 2 sons. That is chapters 8 through 10, which I would put as section 2. Bible Blueprints puts section 3 as 11 through 20 and labels it as rules of hygiene and morality. I think that fits well for chapters 11 through 15, but I would put another break there. Chapter 16 is the Day of Atonement, and I would put this either as its own section or lump it with the rest of the book, chapter 17 through 27. Bible Blueprints labels that as miscellaneous rules, but I prefer Encountering the Old Testaments, the Holiness Code. So that would be how I would break up the book, as you can see. Name of the book. Now here is where we get into some more of the fun stuff. Let's start with the English title of the book, which I think is kind of a poor title, Leviticus, because it contains Levitical law. Kind of have a little bit of a problem with that description. By saying it's Leviticus because it contains Levitical law kind of undermines the book and its purpose. It isn't Levitical law, it's the law of the Mosaic covenant, which is for all Jews. There are portions of the book that are dedicated to the Levites, but even those directions are for the purpose of all of Israel. So even though most of the book is directions for the Levitical priesthood, there are also many directions and laws for all of Israel included in that, and even separate from those Levitical laws, for Israel as a whole and individually. And almost all of the directions for the Levites are given on behalf of the people of Israel. I don't think that the name Leviticus encompasses the heart of the book well. Now we get our title Leviticus from the Latin, which is the same, which comes from the Septuagint Greek Leviticon, which is based off of the Hebrew phrase Torat Kohanim, which means law of priests, as many of its laws relate to the priests. But as I said, I don't think this reflects the whole book well, only a portion of it. Now it's important to mention that the Hebrew I stated above is not the Hebrew name for the book. The Hebrew Bible has a different name for the book than our English or the Latin or the Septuagint, and sticks with its theme of calling the book after its first word, Vayikra, which means, and he called. Now this name for the book is extremely important for the book, which goes into our themes of the book. The theme of Leviticus is holiness. God is holy. Therefore, his people are called to be holy as he is holy. We see this from Leviticus 11:44, 11:45, and 19:2. The latter one saying, "Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." This also connects with being clean, which we'll tackle later. So the theme of Leviticus is holiness, and specifically how to walk blamelessly before God in holiness. The purpose of the book is to show Israel how to live before God and what they are to do when they don't live up to that. Another way of putting this as well is that it's about orderly worship before God. God laid out before his people how he desires to be worshipped, and they must follow in that in order to be holy and blameless before him. Leviticus 10:10-11 is an example of that. God had just killed 2 of Aaron's sons because they had brought strange fire before God. God then directly speaks to Aaron and says, "You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean. And you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses." God is telling Aaron that Israel needs to worship God how he has prescribed. And to do so is to walk in holiness. So what does all of that have to do with the name of the book being Vayikra and he called? Leviticus is all about declarations. It's about calling something blank or such and such. When looking through the book with this title in mind, you will see how often something is declared, how something is called something. Like, this is holy, this is an abomination, this is clean, this is unclean. I'll give you a number of examples throughout the book. 1:17, it is a burnt offering, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord, declaring what this offering is according to how it should be given. 2:16, it is a food offering to the Lord. 3:5, it is a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. 5:9, it is a sin offering. 5:19, it is a guilt offering. He has indeed incurred guilt before the Lord. 6:25, speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law of the sin offering. In the place where the burnt offering is killed, shall the sin offering be killed before the Lord. It is most holy. Look through chapter 11, which speaks of clean and unclean foods. You'll see phrases like, they are unclean to you, or they are detestable to you. And at the end of these, God says, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Again, this is God calling something something. In this case, clean or unclean. So as you go through the book, you'll see God calling things what he declares them to be. This then shows Israel how they are to live before God in holiness. Now, since we just talked about God calling things clean or unclean, let's dive into that. When it comes to the clean and the unclean laws, this is where many misunderstandings arise with regards to the reason why God gave the clean and unclean laws. I want to read you 2 quotes from Bible at a Glance, which are in line and summarize what I often hear people give as the reason for these laws. Leviticus is mostly laws that kept the Hebrew people safe, healthy, and peaceful. Moses described things that are considered unclean, such as various animals and insects. God's purpose was to protect people from germs and unhealthy living. This just isn't true. Sure, it is true that by not eating some of these things, you are being kept from sickness, but that's not the reason for them. To say that it is will actually put you in a dangerous position. All of Leviticus is about walking in holiness before the Lord. That includes the clean and unclean laws. We know this to be true because immediately after God gives these laws about food, he says, "For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourself therefore and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourself with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground. For I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." If you argue that the reason for these laws is purely about health, you then argue that being unhealthy from these things is equivalent to being unholy. If God gave these laws so that Israel could be holy, then health cannot be the primary reason for these laws. It also doesn't add up because not every animal listed as unclean would make you sick to eat. So would those then have a different reason? And if they do have a different reason, why is that not the reason for all the laws given in regards to food? This health argument breaks down even further when we go to Acts 10 and Jesus declares all foods as clean. But we'll get into that in a moment. Before that, I think it would be beneficial to go through some of these clean and unclean laws and give you the actual reason why they are clean or unclean. Israel is permitted to eat animals that part the hoof or have a cloven hoof and chew the cud. If an animal that chews the cud does not have a parted foot, then it is unclean, and vice versa. What is the reason for this? To chew the cud, or more literally, to bring up the cud, is in one sense a reminder to Israel of how their burnt offerings would go up to God. It's the same Hebrew word used. A burnt offering was to be offered out of complete devotion to God. This goes alongside what I believe to be the main reason for this. To bring up the cud is a reminder to Israel about how God brought them up out of Egypt. Israel as a nation was enslaved down in Egypt, but God had brought them up out of Egypt into freedom. And just as Israel went down into the Red Sea and came up into new life and freedom in God, so too is chewing the cud a picture of this. An animal eats the grass, digests it, brings it up, and chews it again. It is a reminder to Israel that they are to be solely devoted to God because God was the one who brought them up out of slavery. Parted hooves and cloven hooves are a picture of this as well. Complete devotion to God. You are to be separate. You are to be holy and sacred before the Lord your God alone, and not other gods. The parted and cloven hoof is an example of this. Just as the hoof is parted, so you are to be parted, to be separated from other nations, their pagan practices and their gods. You are to be separated and wholly devoted to the Lord your God alone. Complete devotion. One of my professors used the example of how in the beginning God separated the light from the darkness. The same principle is true here. They are to be a light in the world and separated from the darkness. It's also a picture of how God is in heaven and separated from the unclean and the unholy on earth. He brought Israel up out of Egypt to be a clean and holy nation among unclean and unholy nations. Chewing, more accurately, bringing up the cud and parted hooves are a picture and a reminder of Israel about this. When you eat one of these clean animals, remember what I have done for you and that you are to be wholly and solely devoted to me alone. Many of the other animals listed as unclean are animals that eat blood. Things with paws, like lions, tigers, bears, even dogs, are things that eat blood and raw meat. You have birds and swarming creatures who do the same. Israel is commanded to not eat blood, and blood is a symbol of life. The soul, or the life, was in the blood, and that is to be devoted to the Lord alone. And so Israel was not to eat creatures that would eat the blood, like pod animals, birds, and many insects, because blood is a symbol of life, and a life that should be devoted solely to God. It's for this same reason that we read later on that a woman's time of the month and as well intercourse would make you unclean. A picture of life being depleted or poured out. Now, Israel was allowed to eat peaceful birds, just not predatory ones. They were also permitted to eat a fish with scales. Both of these come in a large number, which was to draw their mind back to the Abrahamic covenant. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of a great multitude, a nation with as many people as the stars in the heavens and the sand of the seas, and that this people was to be devoted to the Lord alone and to be holy before him. And so Israel could eat these birds and these fish that came in great numbers as a reminder to them of God's blessings unto them. Israel could also eat some insects like locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers. As well, these creatures, both with their legs and how they jump along the ground, are a picture of ascent. Israel went down into the Red Sea and came up in freedom and new life in the Lord. Therefore, eating grasshoppers, crickets, and locusts are a picture and a reminder to Israel how you came up out of Egypt, how I brought you up out of Egypt. Therefore, be solely devoted to me, be holy as I am holy. Israel wasn't even to touch unclean things, since they were to be totally separated from them. This draws your mind back to the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve were to have nothing to do with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but were to be separate from it. These laws are a picture and a reminder that Israel is to be solely devoted to the Lord their God alone, as a holy people. And as I said before, at the end of these food laws, it gives us the reason when it says, he brought them up out of Egypt be holy as he is holy. God did not want his people to be a violent and idolatrous people, but it was his desire that they live life in thanksgiving, ever mindful of their Redeemer. We can draw some parallels to communion. Communion is a Christian's picture of this. We are to partake of the bread and the cup in remembrance of what Christ has done for us, in remembrance of him. He saved us so that we could be a holy people devoted to God. The food laws were given to Israel for them to remember the God who brought them up out of Egypt to be a holy people. So, saying that the food laws were made for health reasons undermines what God has called Israel to be. After the institution of the new covenant, God declared all animals clean. That doesn't make any sense if the reason why God gave these laws in the first place was for health reasons. Is God now saying that we are free to eat animals that would make us sick and unhealthy, since they are now clean? If you argue that the unclean laws were made for health reasons, you inevitably argue that. Also, arguing the health reason takes away from the reason given in Leviticus 11:45. Though health may be a benefit from keeping these laws, it is not the purpose behind them. It also, again, isn't consistent, because not every animal listed as unclean would make you sick to eat. People in Africa and surrounding Middle Eastern areas have been eating these kinds of animals and insects for thousands of years. If it also is about health, then why does a woman's time of the month and intercourse make you unclean? If all of these are pointing to something greater, then it makes sense. Clean and unclean is a matter of the heart. The laws were given to show Israel where their heart should lie, with God. Not the idols and the gods that they worship back in the land of Egypt, and not with the nations who do not worship God. Their heart was to be the Lord's alone. Why then did God make all animals clean? If the clean and unclean laws were to point Israel to God, why change that? Because of the Gentiles. Because of the Gentiles. Salvation in Christ was not given to just the Jewish people, the clean people before God. It was given to every nation. Jesus declares to Peter that all animals are now clean because he does not want them to treat the Gentiles as if they are unclean, as if they are somehow lesser than Jewish believers because they're Gentiles. We are all one in Christ. Gentiles were also never under the law, nor were they ever enslaved in Egypt. It doesn't make sense to put them under the law and under the clean and unclean laws when Egypt isn't something they can historically look back on and remember. What can they look back on and remember? Christ's death for them on the cross. They are called to look back on this and remember. It's communion. It's the Lord's Supper. I will quote from one of my professors back in Bible college, Mr. Armstrong, from his book, The Lord Has Spoken. If you do not own this book, I would highly recommend that you buy it. He says, "It is not wrong for Jews to have a remembrance of their salvation out of Egypt, which the food laws provide daily. It is wrong for Jews to use the food laws to give the impression that God is unwilling to reach the Gentiles apart from the law. It is also wrong for the Jews to use the food laws to declare those whom God has sanctified by the giving of his Holy Spirit not worthy of a full acceptance and fellowship. Furthermore, the food laws would never be fully embraced by the Gentiles, since they are declared unclean by them, and since they were never saved out of Egypt." Now, there are other clean and unclean laws, such as skin diseases. Many of these types of unclean laws were a picture of not being pure and blameless before the Lord. Just like how you couldn't offer a spotted or speckled lamb because it was not a picture of blamelessness and purity. The same principle is true with these kinds of unclean laws about skin diseases. Now, to close off this section, I must say that being unclean under the law isn't necessarily sin. When someone becomes unclean, it doesn't mean that they have sinned. There is a difference. Unclean is not equal to sin. A good picture of this is intercourse or a woman's time of the month. If you have intercourse with your spouse, you are unclean. If unclean equals sin, then every time a married couple has intercourse, they are sinning. This is not true and contradicts scripture, which tells married couples to have intercourse. So, unclean is not equal to sin. However, if you were unclean, there were certain things that you could not do. And if you did them, then it would be a sin. For example, if you were unclean, you could not go to the temple. The temple was a picture of purity, of worship, the cleansing of sin, God's presence among Israel. Therefore, one who was unclean could not go to the temple. I hope that you have found this video to be beneficial, and it gave you a better idea of the book of Leviticus. Now I want to close by stressing that Christ fulfilled the law, and we are no longer under it. We who are Gentiles were never under the law to begin with, and for someone to try and put us under the law is wrong. That is why Paul wrote his letter to the Galatian churches. So if someone says, you can't do such and such because Leviticus says this, know that you are not under the law as a whole and are not under that specific law either. Now, some of the laws are reiterated in the New Testament, and we are commanded to keep them, but the command to keep them isn't based off of Leviticus, it is based off of what is written and commanded in the New Testament. Do not burden yourself by putting yourself under the law when you have been freed by grace. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, give this video a like, and why don't you subscribe to the channel? That is everything for today. I know it was a lot, so until next time, remember to know the word, do the word, and share the word, but as always, we do it in love.